Welcome to my channel. What if I told you that the most valuable company in the world started in a small garage with two young men and a dream? Yes, you heard it right. Today, we are going to explore the Apple story. But this is not just about computers and phones. It's about vision, struggle, failure, and big success. Stay with me till the end, because each chapter will surprise you and teach you something new about Apple's journey from a simple idea to a global empire. Chapter 1. The Garage Dream. How Apple Began. In the year 1976 in California, two young men started something that looked very small, but it would one day grow into one of the most powerful companies in the world. Their names were Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak. They were not rich. They were not famous. They were just two friends who shared a big dream. Wozniak, often called Woz, loved to build things. He was the kind of person who could sit for hours with wires, circuits, and a soldering iron, and then suddenly a new machine would come to life in front of him. He had a gift for technology, and he enjoyed creating for fun. Steve Jobs was very different. He didn't build machines, but he had vision. He could see possibilities. He believed that technology could be more than just for scientists or big companies. He wanted to make it simple, beautiful, and something that ordinary people could use. Jobs was also a strong speaker. He could tell stories about products in a way that made people excited. Together, Jobs and Wozniak were a perfect team. One had the hands to build. The other had the eyes to dream. But here is the surprising part. Apple did not start in a shiny office, or in a tall building, or in a professional lab. It started in a small garage. A garage that belonged to Steve Jobs' parents. There were no secret investors. There was no big company helping them. It was just two young men, a dream, and a lot of hard work. At first, they had no money to buy the parts they needed, so they sold what little they had. Steve Jobs sold his old Volkswagen van. Wozniak sold his calculator. Imagine that. Selling your personal things to buy pieces of wire and chips. It sounds risky, but they believed in their dream. That moment was the real birth of Apple. The first computer they built together was called the Apple I. It was not like the laptops or smartphones we use today. It was just a simple board with chips and circuits, without even a case around it. But in those days, this was something very new. Computers were huge machines that filled whole rooms, and they were used only by scientists, banks, or governments. Jobs and Wozniak had a very different idea. They believed that computers should be small, simple, and personal. Not for big companies, but for families, for students, for ordinary people. This idea was not common at that time. People thought they were crazy. But that crazy idea was actually the beginning of a revolution. The first spike moment in the story comes when Jobs and Wozniak tried to sell their Apple I. They went to a small computer store called the Byte Shop. The owner, Paul Terrell, looked at the strange machine on the board and saw something new. He agreed to buy 50 units, but only if they were fully assembled, not just parts. Jobs promised they could do it, even though they had no experience in mass production. Imagine two young men in a garage, suddenly asked to make 50 computers. They worked day and night, with friends helping, soldering each part by hand. It was not easy, but they delivered. Those 50 computers became the very first sale in Apple's history. It was the proof that their idea could work. After that, things started moving fast. With the money from sales, they built the Apple II in 1977. This was the computer that made Apple famous. It was colorful, it was small, and it was ready to use right out of the box. Unlike other computers of that time, you did not need to build or program it yourself. Anyone could use it. This made Apple stand out. The Apple II became popular in schools, in homes, and in small businesses. Suddenly, the world was noticing this little company from a garage. But it wasn't just about machines. Jobs wanted Apple to be more than just a computer company. He wanted Apple to be about design, simplicity, and creativity. He said, "We have to make computers not just for engineers, but for everyone." This was his dream, to put a computer on every desk, and later, in every hand. And with the Apple II, that dream began to look real. Now think about this for a moment. In less than 2 years, 2 young men with no office, no big money, and no powerful team built something that would change history. Isn't that amazing? That's the spike moment here. The idea that from a small garage, Apple became one of the first companies to show the world that computers could belong to everyone, not just experts. It teaches us something very important. Great things often start small, and they often start in unexpected places. By the end of the 1970s, Apple was growing very fast. Investors came in. The company became bigger. In 1980, Apple went public, meaning people could buy its shares. Suddenly, Steve Jobs, Wozniak, and many of their friends became millionaires. Imagine that in just a few short years, 2 young dreamers went from soldering boards in a garage to running a company worth hundreds of millions. The world had never seen anything like it. But success also brings new challenges. The world of technology moves quickly. New competitors were rising. Bigger companies like IBM were entering the personal computer market. Jobs and Wozniak had started a revolution, but to keep Apple alive, they needed to keep creating, keep innovating, and keep dreaming bigger. And as we will see in the next chapter, success does not always last. Apple's story is not just about rising up. It is also about falling down and finding the courage to rise again. Chapter 2: Falling and Rising Again. Apple's Struggles. By the early 1980s, Apple was no longer just a garage dream. It was a real company with offices, employees, and millions of dollars. The Apple II had made them successful, but Steve Jobs was not satisfied. He wanted to create something even greater, something that would truly change how people used computers. Jobs had a vision of making computers that were not only powerful, but also easy to use, friendly, and even beautiful. He wanted to give people the feeling that technology was not scary, but something they could love. This vision led to the creation of the Macintosh. The Macintosh, or Mac, was introduced in 1984. It was unlike anything the world had ever seen. It had a mouse. It had icons and windows on a screen. You didn't have to type complex commands anymore. You could just point, click, and move things around. For the first time, ordinary people could use a computer without needing to know programming. To launch it, Jobs planned one of the most famous ads in history, the 1984 commercial. It showed a woman running into a gray, controlled world and breaking the screen with a hammer, announcing that Apple was bringing freedom and creativity to people. The commercial shocked the world. People were amazed. The Macintosh became a symbol of a new era. But here comes the twist. While the Macintosh looked beautiful and exciting, inside the company, things were not going smoothly. The first Macintosh was expensive. It was slower than some of its competitors. Sales were not as strong as Jobs hoped. And more than that, Steve Jobs' personality started to create tension. He was brilliant, but he was also very demanding, often shouting at employees, pushing them to extremes, and making quick, risky decisions. Many people admired his passion, but others found it difficult to work with him. The board of Apple, which included investors and business leaders, began to worry. The spike moment comes in 1985, when Steve Jobs, the very man who created Apple, was forced out of his own company. Imagine that. The company he had started in a garage, the dream he had lived for almost 10 years, was suddenly taken away from him. The board decided to support John Scully, the CEO Jobs himself had hired from Pepsi instead of Jobs. It was painful, shocking, and almost unbelievable. Jobs was only 30 years old and he was out of Apple. For many, it looked like the end of his story. Without Jobs, Apple continued to make computers, but something was missing. The company became more focused on business decisions than bold ideas. Competitors like IBM and Microsoft grew stronger. Microsoft's Windows system looked very similar to the Macintosh but ran on cheaper computers, making it more popular in homes and offices. Apple's sales started to fall. The 1990s were hard years. Products like the Newton, an early handheld device, failed in the market. Apple lost money year after year. People began to say Apple was dying. Some even predicted it would shut down completely. Imagine, the same company that had once been the symbol of innovation was now almost forgotten. But Steve Jobs did not give up. After leaving Apple, he started a new company called Next. The computers Next made were not very successful in sales, but the technology inside them was advanced. At the same time, Jobs bought a small animation studio from George Lucas. That studio was called Pixar. Under Jobs' leadership, Pixar created Toy Story in 1995, the world's first full computer-animated movie. It became a huge success, and Pixar grew into a giant in the movie industry. Jobs had lost Apple, but he had not lost his ability to dream and build. Meanwhile, back at Apple, things were getting worse. By the mid-1990s, Apple was weeks away from bankruptcy. The company was desperate for a new direction. In 1997, something unexpected happened. Apple decided to buy Next, the company Jobs had started. And with that purchase, Steve Jobs returned to Apple after 12 years away. This was a dramatic moment, like a hero coming back when everything seems lost. At first, Jobs came as an advisor, but very soon he became the leader again. The spike moment here is this. When Jobs returned, Apple had only a few months of cash left. It was a dying company. But Jobs brought with him a new vision, new energy, and a clear sense of focus. He cut down the long list of confusing products. He simplified Apple's lineup. He told his team, "We are going to make 4 great products, one for home, one for work, one for professionals, and one for everyone." He wanted Apple to be simple again, not messy. In 1998, Apple launched the iMac. It was colorful, it was playful, and it was easy to use. It did not look like a boring gray box. It looked like something fun to put on your desk. The iMac became a hit, and it marked the beginning of Apple's rise again. Suddenly, people were talking about Apple once more. The company that was almost dead was now alive. This chapter teaches us something powerful. Success is not permanent. Failure can come even after great victories. But what truly matters is the ability to rise again. Jobs was thrown out of his own company, humiliated and almost forgotten. Apple was close to disappearing. And yet, both Jobs and Apple found a way to come back stronger. That's what makes this part of the story so inspiring. It is not just about technology. It is about resilience, belief, and the courage to start again when everything seems lost. As we move to the next chapter, the world is about to see a new Apple. The company is no longer just about computers. It is about to change music, phones, and even the way we live. The rise after the fall is only the beginning. Chapter 3: The iPhone Revolution, Changing the World. By the late 1990s, Apple was alive again. The iMac had saved the company, and Steve Jobs was back in control. But Jobs was not interested in just surviving. He wanted Apple to lead. He wanted Apple to change the world. To do that, he needed to think bigger than computers. Computers were important, but Jobs believed technology could touch people's lives in many more ways. He wanted to put Apple in the center of people's daily lives. The first step came in 2001, with the iPod. At that time, people listened to music on CDs or small MP3 players that could only hold a few songs. Jobs introduced the iPod with a simple line: 1,000 songs in your pocket. It was small, it was simple, and it was beautiful. The iPod changed the music industry. Apple also launched iTunes, a platform where people could buy and organize songs. For the first time, people didn't need to buy whole albums. They could just buy the songs they loved. The iPod and iTunes worked together perfectly, and Apple became not just a computer company, but also a music company. Millions of people now carried Apple in their pockets. But Jobs was not finished. While other companies focused on making better MP3 players or computers, Jobs was already dreaming about the next big thing. He looked at the devices people carried with them every day: a phone, a music player, and maybe a small handheld device for email or notes. Jobs asked a bold question: what if we could combine all of these into one device? A device that was simple, powerful, and beautiful. This idea became the iPhone. In January 2007, Jobs walked onto the stage in his black turtleneck, blue jeans, and sneakers. He looked at the audience and said, "Today, Apple is going to reinvent the phone." Then he explained that Apple was introducing 3 revolutionary products: an iPod, a phone, and an internet communicator. The audience clapped, thinking he meant 3 different products. But then Jobs revealed the truth. These are not 3 separate devices. This is one device. And we are calling it iPhone. The crowd went wild. It was one of the most memorable product launches in history. The spike moment here is simple. The iPhone was not just a phone. It was a pocket computer. It had a touchscreen with no physical keyboard. You could tap, swipe, and pinch with your fingers. You could browse the internet, listen to music, watch videos, and make calls, all from the same device. It was like science fiction turning into reality. When the iPhone launched, many competitors laughed. Some said it was too expensive. Others said no one would want a phone without buttons. But very quickly, the world realized this was the future. People lined up outside Apple stores for hours, even days, just to get their hands on the iPhone. The first iPhone changed how people thought about technology. Suddenly, everyone wanted a smartphone. But Jobs had planned even more. In 2008, Apple launched the App Store. This allowed developers from all over the world to create apps for the iPhone. Suddenly, the iPhone was not just a device, it was a platform. You could download apps to play games, book tickets, read news, or even learn languages. The App Store turned the iPhone into something personal for every user. Each iPhone could be unique, depending on the apps you chose. This was another revolution. Within a few years, the iPhone transformed entire industries. Cameras, music players, GPS devices, calculators, even alarm clocks. All of them were replaced by one device in your pocket. The iPhone became a part of daily life. It changed how we talk, how we work, how we shop, how we connect. It created new companies like Uber, Instagram, and WhatsApp, which existed only because the iPhone made them possible. The spike moment in history came in 2010 when Apple introduced the iPad. People asked, "Why do we need a tablet when we already have a phone and a computer?" But Jobs saw the gap. He believed people wanted something bigger than a phone, but simpler than a laptop. The iPad became popular for reading, watching, and working on the go. Once again, Apple created a new category of device. By this time, Apple was no longer just a company that made computers. It was a lifestyle brand. People loved the design, the simplicity, and the experience. Apple stores were opening around the world, and people didn't just buy products there. They had experiences. Walking into an Apple store felt different. It felt like being part of a community. Financially, Apple was now the strongest it had ever been. By 2011, Apple had become the most valuable company in the world. From a small garage to global dominance, it had been a wild journey. But behind all of this was Steve Jobs. His vision, his passion, and his attention to detail shaped Apple into what it had become. He cared about every small thing: the design of the box, the way the screen looked, the feel of the buttons. To him, it was not just about technology. It was about making something magical. But life has a way of testing even the greatest leaders. As Apple rose to its highest point, Jobs was fighting a personal battle. He had been diagnosed with cancer years earlier, and by 2011, his health was declining. On October 5, 2011, Steve Jobs passed away at the age of 56. The world mourned. Millions of people around the globe lit candles, left flowers at Apple stores, and shared how Jobs had touched their lives. Apple had lost its visionary. And yet, the legacy of the iPhone lived on. The device Jobs introduced in 2007 had changed everything. It was not just a product. It was a revolution. Even today, every smartphone, whether Apple or Android, carries the DNA of that first iPhone. The world before 2007 and the world after 2007 are two different places. The iPhone teaches us something deep. Sometimes one idea can change the course of history. It shows us the power of dreaming big and refusing to accept limits.